Jean-François, first of all, welcome back.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, let me begin by asking, there's a couple of stories today I want to get to. First of all, we were chatting earlier on with Jim Meny about this weird decision by François Legault the past couple of days on asylum seekers, on temporary immigrants. He's in France, of course, right now for meetings there. First, he brought up the idea of waiting zones, saying this is something they do in Europe. We should consider doing that here. And then today, seemingly out of nowhere, he said we should remove, and he said Ottawa should do it, half of all asylum seekers in Quebec. That's 80,000 people he wants removed from the province. And then he added the word forcibly if needed. What do you make of this?
Well, he's been saying for at least a year that he wants the federal government to reduce all temporary migrants by half. And that always included the part of asylum seekers. Of course, the difference is that the temporary worker is here temporarily. So if you don't renew his permit, then he leaves, and then you can decrease the number. The asylum seeker that has his request certified is not temporary, wants to stay. Now, the problem is the backlog, because before Mark Miller, in the time of Sean Fraser and other ministers of immigration, the policy was that if you had asylum seekers or refugees like the Syrians, Ottawa would make the repartition across Canada without the consent of the asylum seeker and without the consent of the province, because they felt that this was the right way to do it. And if a refugee comes to Canada, he will be somewhere in Canada decided by Ottawa. But in the last few years, they stopped doing that. And now Mr. Miller says it's inhumane to do that, which seems to say that the previous ministers of his own government were inhumane. But whatever, so there's a big backlog. I think it is unfathomable to say that 80,000 people who are in Quebec will be displaced against their will. But things can be tried. I mean, we could restart the policy that when you arrive in Dorval, a lot of people coming from India or Pakistan or China, they come to Canada. Some of them don't even know that French is the main language in Quebec. And so you say, well, do you have family in Quebec? Yes. Well, you stay here. Do you speak French? Do you want to stay here? Okay, you stay here. But if not, we have a repartition system, and we'll bring you somewhere where you'll be lodged and fed, and we'll try to find you a job. And I think most asylum seekers would welcome that because they want to come to Canada. Now, for the backlog, Mr. Miller said in a letter these past few days that he was imagining an incentive program for people to move elsewhere than where they are now in Quebec and in Ontario. I think this should be tried before anything else can be imagined.
I think I remember we had Mark Miller on the show last week. I think the one thing that came up in this idea of letting these people go somewhere else is apparently not all provinces are on board with this idea. So it's good in theory, but in execution, not necessarily workable yet.
You're absolutely right, because when Ottawa did this repetition before, the numbers were manageable. Now, because this is Ottawa's responsibility, that the numbers are no longer manageable. And so some provinces have said just no. Daniel Smith in Alberta says we don't want any more. And in New Brunswick, they said or Nova Scotia, well, if they're not nurses or in the building trade, we don't want them. So now we have this de-solidarity in Canada on this issue that makes the problem more difficult. But that, again, the mismanagement is Ottawa's. I mean, they have messed it up, and now everyone's a victim.
But this idea where François Legault felt it necessary to say forcibly, right, to remove them, I mean, that's a little over the top, isn't it? Even as far as, he's concerned?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. I think I would have, I told you how I think this should be approached.
Yeah.
But I understand his frustration because, I mean, as seasons pass, the inability of Ottawa to handle this problem makes it worse and worse and worse at every season.
All right, let me move on and talk about what the Bloc did today in Ottawa. This idea of asking the Liberals, of course, for two conditions, one of them to do with old age security, the other to do with supply management. Today was on the issue of this extra money, the old age seniors, the extra 10% for people over the age of 65, or in this particular case, 65 to 74. I wonder, they had a vote on this. The vote goes through. It's non-binding. It seems like an awful lot of show for something we know is not going to end up happening. So why bother with this?
Well, we're not sure it's not going to happen. So the Trudeau government stayed in power because it agreed to some of the things that the NDP wanted. That was the only reason. They would have lost power without that. Now, the NDP makes us believe that they are willing to go in election, but that's to be proven. Now, the Bloc is saying, well, if you want us to support you, these are the two things that matter the most for us. So now it's Trudeau's decision. Does he want to commit political suicide now and go to the polls at the worst possible time, given the voting intentions that we have? Or does he want to stay in power for a few more months, maybe until the next budget, and then he has to do with the Bloc what he did with the NDP for 2 years? Now, that's his decision. There's nothing insurmountable in the two demands of the Bloc, one of which applies to all provinces and one of which applies to two provinces, the supply agreement. So it's really up to the willingness of Mr. Trudeau. Today, they said that they would vote against the motion because they didn't want to create a precedent whereby with a motion you would tie up the government on financial matters. So, of course, there's a lot of aggressivity in the Liberal ranks against the Bloc, but Ms. Freeland and Mr. Duclos say that discussions are going on. So they haven't made up their mind. Will they fall on this? And then the Bloc will say, we fought for the elderly in Quebec, and if you don't have 10% more, it's because of Trudeau. I mean, that's not something you want to run on, or do you want to try and they can cut a deal? They can decide to phase this in over 3 years. They can, we haven't seen any counteroffer, so it's all in Trudeau's mind.
Yeah, with all due respect, so this idea that today they said they gave you the indication, the Liberals did, that no. But look, the one thing that gets talked about in here is the fact that you're looking at basically a $16 billion agreement over the course of 5 years at a time when the government can ill afford to spend that kind of money. Doesn't that make it moot?
Well, the Conservatives will say that everything they did up till now was too costly. Okay, so it's $3 billion a year. They could decide to phase it in or to not give 10%, but a little. They could shave maybe half of this amount for the next two budgets. But listen, they have been spending a substantial amount. What the Bloc is saying that, listen, guys, you're giving the oil industry $12 billion a year. So, and they don't need it. Their profits are up 300% this year, the oil industry in Canada. So if you're looking for money, take it there. It's a sound point. It will not happen, but
we'll leave it at that. Okay.